If you're over 40 and taking creatine, there's a good chance most of it never makes it where you need it to go. That doesn't mean creatine is a weak supplement. It's the opposite. Creatine is one of the most heavily researched compounds in sports and longevity science, with hundreds of clinical trials behind it. It builds muscle, it supports brain function, and a growing body of research suggests it may help with fat metabolism as people move past 40. But there's a gap between what creatine can do and what it actually does once it's sitting in a glass of water in your kitchen. That gap is absorption, and almost nobody talks about it. If you've ever felt like creatine just doesn't work for you, stick with this. The problem is rarely the supplement, it's usually the conditions you're taking it under. Creatine isn't a bodybuilding supplement, it's a cellular fuel system. For 3 decades, creatine has been marketed almost exclusively to people chasing bigger arms. That branding has done real damage because it convinced a huge number of people, especially women, especially anyone over 40, that creatine wasn't for them. Here's the more accurate picture. Creatine is a cellular energy molecule. It helps regenerate ATP, the energy currency your cells run on. Every tissue that burns a lot of energy depends on ATP. Your heart, your brain, your immune system, and yes, your muscles. Most of the body's creatine, roughly 95%, is stored in skeletal muscle. The rest sits in the brain, heart, and nervous system, the systems that tend to show the earliest signs of age-related decline. After 40, natural creatine stores start to drop. Muscle mass shrinks, a process known as sarcopenia. Mitochondria, the structures inside cells that generate ATP, become less efficient. The result isn't just weaker workouts, it's slower metabolism, longer recovery times, and the kind of mental fog that makes people feel like they're not quite as sharp as they used to be. Researchers increasingly describe this as a cellular energy problem, not simply an inevitable consequence of aging. Some recent longevity literature has flagged creatine as an underused tool for supporting the muscle-brain connection specifically in older adults, and ongoing clinical trials are now testing whether creatine supplementation can help with mild cognitive impairment in aging populations. Why the supplement doesn't automatically reach the cell? Creatine can't just diffuse into a muscle cell on its own. It needs a specific transport protein, a kind of gated doorway in the cell membrane, to actively pull it inside. That transporter is sodium dependent. It requires sodium to function. This creates a problem for a lot of health-conscious adults. Many people today are walking around in a mildly low-sodium, underhydrated state without realizing it, cutting salt out of clean eating, relying on coffee for hydration, sweating through workouts, and then taking their creatine dose in plain water on an empty stomach. Under those conditions, the transporter barely opens, and a meaningful portion of the dose just circulates until the kidneys filter it out and it's excreted. This isn't speculation. A frequently cited 1996 study in Acta Physiologica Scandinavica compared 2 groups of healthy men taking the same 5-gram creatine dose over 5 days. One group in plain water, the other alongside carbohydrates that triggered an insulin response. The carbohydrate group retained substantially more creatine in muscle tissue than the plain water group, and follow-up studies in later years reproduced the effect. The mechanism is straightforward. Insulin signaling boosts sodium transport activity, and that's what opens the door for creatine to get into the cell. The takeaway isn't about brand or dose. It's about the internal conditions, hydration, sodium, and insulin activity at the moment you take it. The fat loss angle nobody expects. Creatine isn't a stimulant-style fat burner. It doesn't raise heart rate or increase sweating the way caffeine does, so for years it was assumed to have little to do with body composition. More recent research complicates that assumption. A meta-analysis published in Nutrients looking at adults over 50 doing resistance training found that the creatine group lost more fat mass than the placebo group, despite matched training and diet. A later meta-analysis in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, covering multiple randomized trials in younger adults, found a modest but consistent fat mass reduction associated with creatine supplementation. There are a few plausible explanations. Cellular energy output. Cells with more available ATP tend to function and burn fuel more efficiently, including at rest. More efficient mitochondria can mean a small but real increase in resting energy expenditure. Thermogenic fat tissue. A notable 2015 study published in Cell identified what researchers called a futile creatine cycle, occurring in beige and brown fat, the more metabolically active fat tissue involved in heat production. In that research, creatine appeared to help drive mitochondrial activity in this tissue, and animal studies where creatine metabolism was disrupted in fat cells showed impaired temperature regulation and insulin resistance. Glucose handling. A study published in Diabetes immobilized one leg of healthy volunteers for 2 weeks, then compared recovery with and without creatine supplementation. The creatine group showed a notably larger rebound in GLUT4, the transporter protein responsible for pulling glucose out of the bloodstream into muscle, compared to the placebo group. Better glucose uptake generally supports better insulin sensitivity, which is closely tied to fat metabolism and steadier energy throughout the day. None of these mechanisms matter, though, if the creatine never gets into the cell in the first place. The pattern behind "it doesn't work for me," a lot of people who say creatine didn't do anything for them are unintentionally sabotaging absorption in a few common ways. Taking it fasted, first thing in the morning. After a night without food or fluids, sodium levels and hydration are typically at their lowest point of the day, the worst possible window for the transporter to be active. Taking it immediately after an intense workout or sauna session, when the body has just lost significant sodium and fluid through sweat. Using a poorly manufactured product. Cheap, coarsely milled creatine can dissolve poorly, irritate the gut, and pass through without being absorbed, which is often the real source of the "creatine bloats me" complaint. Skipping food or electrolytes around the dose, removing the insulin and sodium signals the transporter depends on. Inconsistent daily use. Creatine works by gradually saturating muscle stores over roughly 2 to 4 weeks. Skipping days repeatedly means never reaching that saturation point. A simple, absorption-focused routine. 1. Take a consistent 5-gram dose daily. Saturation depends on regularity, not occasional large doses. 2. Pair it with a real meal, ideally one with some carbohydrate and protein, not necessarily a sugary drink. A normal meal's insulin response is generally enough to activate the sodium transporter. 3. Hydrate beforehand, not just alongside it. Drinking water 20-30 minutes ahead of the dose helps ensure the cell isn't already working from a deficit. 4. Don't ignore sodium. For people on lower carb or low sodium diets, a small amount of salt or an electrolyte source alongside the dose can serve a similar role to the insulin response from carbohydrates. 5. Rehydrate and replace electrolytes before taking creatine after intense exercise or heat exposure, not the other way around. None of this is complicated. It's mostly about timing creatine to moments when your body's sodium and insulin signaling are actually working in its favor rather than fighting against it. Why this matters beyond the gym. The value of properly absorbed creatine isn't really about aesthetics. The same compound that supports muscle tissue is also active in brain energy metabolism. A 2024 study published in Scientific Reports found that a single high dose of creatine measurably supported cognitive performance and brain energy status during a night of sleep deprivation. It's the same compound implicated in slowing the roughly 8% per decade strength loss associated with sarcopenia after 40. The same one active in the thermogenic fat tissue cycle identified in the Harvard Cell research. The same one your heart and immune cells rely on for baseline energy production. Creatine remains one of the cheapest, most extensively studied compounds available for supporting cellular energy as people age, but only if it's actually getting where it needs to go. This script is an original piece written for educational purposes, referencing publicly available research. It does not reproduce or closely paraphrase any specific existing script, article, or advertisement.